It was just a couple of years ago that Riley Gaines was here in the KCMO Talk Radio studios advocating and lobbying on behalf of young women around the country who were sick of having to compete against men in women's sports. And now, of course, her star has only risen since then. You see her on Fox News. She is the host of Gaines for Girls at Outkick.com, and she is joining us on KCMO. Riley, thanks for being here. Do you remember your trip out to Kansas? And it's great to have you back on the show.
Of course I do. I'm thrilled to be back on with you. I remember when I came down to Kansas initially, it was to advocate and really champion and support Derek Schmidt, who, of course, was running against now current Governor Laura Kelly. So it's, and of course, we've seen her treatment, or really should I say mistreatment of women, of children, of parental rights over the past few years.
You know, you have obviously been one of the leading voices on this issue of protecting women in their sports and also just, protecting kids in general. Last week, of course, the legislature in Kansas overrode the governor's veto of legislation where they're now saying, hey, this surgery stuff for kids, the hormone treatments, not going to happen anymore until you're an adult, in which case you can do with your body what you want. What is your sense as you, of course, follow this issue around the country? Are people waking up, even those that maybe a couple of years ago were kind of towing the woke line on this stuff, so to speak?
Of course, I believe that. Well, that was made, it's not even really a matter of what I think. It was made very clear on November 5th that the American people reject, of course, I've said this many times, I believe, of course, on November 5th, people turned out to the polls to embrace Donald Trump, to embrace his cabinet picks, and to embrace the America First agenda. But more so, I believe people turned out to the polls to reject absurdity. And that is what the Democratic Party has become, entirely and thoroughly absurd from top to bottom, whether it's believing that children as young as 5, 6 years old are self-aware enough to chemically or surgically castrate themselves, whether it's putting men in women's sports, whether it's putting tampons in boys' bathrooms, whether it's referring to Latino individuals as Latinx. The Democratic Party, they've lost the ability to communicate with your everyday, average, common sense American who intuitively knows that men and women are different and that kids belong to their parents. So I think the Democratic Party has become out of touch with reality and the issues that everyday Americans face. That being said, absolutely, I believe every day the number of people who are now willing to be bold and willing to state the obvious and to oppose this nonsense, it's growing in masses.
Well, that's exactly right. And you were on the front end of this because, listen, there are a lot of people who dealt with the same thing as you, where, you were losing out on races because you were competing against a biological male, and they wouldn't say anything about it. Now I feel like young women are emboldened and are speaking out more so than ever. And as the father of 3 daughters, I personally thank you for that. So when you hear from these young women and you hear from some of these groups and these teams and coaches around the country, how much different is it today than it was, let's say, even a couple of years ago when you were here in Kansas?
It is so crazy to me. I think about 3 years ago to now. 3 years ago, it was not favorable to say that men and women are different. That statement alone would get you called, of course, transphobic, homophobic, a racist, a white supremacist, a domestic terrorist, a fascist, a Nazi. The list goes on. My favorite, actually, of what people will call you for saying that women deserve equal opportunity is a misogynist. I'm like, what in the world? How can you even contrive that defamatory name calling from defending women? But you compare that, and oftentimes, let me mention, I faced violence in many cases just a few years ago. Like, I've been accosted, I've been ambushed, I've been physically assaulted, I've been spit on, I've had drinks poured at me, I've had glass bottles thrown at me, I've been held for ransom in San Francisco for, 4, almost 5 hours to the middle of the night, where protesters demanded that if I wanted to make it back home safely to see my family again, I had to pay them money. You compare that to now, where it is the cool thing to say that men cannot become women and vice versa. It has shifted entirely. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, because of course courage begets courage, and there's strength in numbers. But two, understanding we have a different administration in the White House where we won't be reprimanded. We won't be, oftentimes put at a detriment for saying these things, losing our jobs, whatever that looks like, especially those federal jobs or institutional jobs at academic universities or whatever it is. Now cancel culture is kind of losing its grip.
Mm-hmm. Now, what year, what was that, 2020? Would that have been 2021 when you dealt with all your stuff with Will Thomas?
It was 2022 was that national championships.
Oh, it was. Okay, so it was the championships of 22. So, yeah, it has been 3 years since all that was going down. And now you look at how things have just turned on its head. I'm not looking for you to necessarily pat yourself on the back. I can do that for you. You've done a great job on this. But is there a moment that you look at on the last 3 years? Obviously, the election comes to mind. But is there some type of cultural moment that you think back to in the last 3 years where you say, wow, people are starting to see the light and their opinions are starting to change?
There's quite a few. As you said, of course, the election, I believe that was a big one. It was where people were finally able to voice how they felt without actually having to say it out loud or having to disclose it. And in realizing that you are in the majority, that, of course, inspires boldness. But I think some other things leading up to the election, number one, the attack on children, it had reached a point, and still, I don't want to use past tense verbiage because understand this war on woke, it certainly has not been won yet. Mm-hmm. But it had, under the Biden administration, it had reached a point where even Kamala Harris was campaigning on it, saying, look, some sort of word salad quote she had where it's the children of the community are the children of the community. And I think that's a wake-up call for people, my children don't belong to you. My children don't belong to the White House. They belong to my house. And I think that was probably the biggest factor honestly, in the election. I believe the issue of men and women's sports, I believe the medicalization of children as it pertains to the gender ideology movement, I believe those were the sleeper issues of the election. And it's been so wild to me following the election, following, November 5th and even January 20th, where you would imagine that these Democrats, at least in terms of elected representation or the media, for example, they would start to recant from their positions or from their previous statements or from their voting records. But that is not at all how these Democrats have handled this. They've doubled down. And in doing so, I believe they'll make it very easy in 2026 and likely 2028 if this is the attitude that they continue to push forward.
Riley Gaines, find her show Gaines for Girls at Outkick.com is where you can find it. Riley, thank you so much for being back on KCMO. Great to have you here. Keep up the outstanding work, and we appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.
Well, likewise. Thank you.
You as well. Riley Gaines, great job by her on 95.7 FM.